Hello, this is Strategy Miscellany, and we are back with Children of a Dead Earth. I did a video on module design quite some time ago, but for a lot of it, I really didn't know what I was talking about. And so now I've read some stuff on the Discord, a little bit on the forums. I've done some more experimentation. I've read the commentary people have provided on the previous video, and I think I'm in a better place with my example module designs now to actually have them be somewhat useful. So I figure I'll start with some of the simpler designs that you can make, like this propellant tank here, and then we'll slowly move up through the more complicated stuff. And I'll put in the description a little kind of table of contents about what we're looking at each specific point in time. So this is a propellant tank. It's pretty easy to design those. Most of what you're doing is redesigning, basically resizing, kind of tailoring it to your ship. It's usually a good idea to have a lot of small tanks rather than a few big tanks on your ship so that if one gets hit, it doesn't ruin everything. Basically, the best material is vanadium chromium steel, except in a few maybe niche cases. You can see how it creates this amazing mass ratio of 120 with this tank filled with fancy kerosene RP1. I can use some other example materials here and they won't be as good. Reinforced carbon's another good one, but you can see the mass ratio is not as good. Um, you could also try and be cheap and use something like a cheaper metal like titanium. Mass ratio is only 33 now, and you haven't really saved that much money over the VCS here. And see, it's basically the same cost, way better mass ratio. Depending on how full, what you're filling the tank with, you'll get better or worse ratios. I mean, something like hydrogen is going to give you a bad mass ratio, even with the best material. I mean, a 12 is not terrible, but it's not great. And you can see that tank is super bulky because hydrogen just doesn't compress all that well. At least unless you're doing, liquefied hydrogen or something, which I don't think they're doing here. Meanwhile, you get something like mercury. You can have a tiny little tank, great mass ratio, but of course, there's not that much useful you can do with a tank of mercury. You can make a mercury nuclear thermal rocket. It's not great though. Environmental consequences aside of spraying mercury vapor all over the solar system, it's just not a great propellant. So this is why you might want to use a denser propellant for your ships, like RP1 as opposed to methane. There's usually kind of a trade-off between specific impulse and density of propellant. And then there's the aspect ratio. Generally, a long and skinny aspect ratio will result in a better mass ratio than a short and squat one. You can see here, if I take this guy down, make it real short and squat, let's bring it all the way down to, say, half the height of its width. Now the mass ratio is only half as good. Well, slightly better, but basically half as good. So that's why it's usually best to have a lot of long and skinny tanks in your ship. Something between an aspect ratio of, say, 5 and even up to the max here, which is 20, it looks like. That'll usually put you in good stead. So that's fuel tanks. Pretty simple. Another simple one is refuelers here. So these are how you would refuel another ship from a tanker. They built some of them in the base game. They all use huge amounts of electricity. Well, relatively huge anyway. And so I just made an example of a smaller one here. So this refuels RP1, 1.74 tons per second, 881 kilowatts. It's not super fast, but it's a lot cheaper. Or not cheaper, but it's a lot less power requirement than most of these. And there's not really that much to change. I mean, you want to keep the hose length as a full kilometer. There's really no reason not to, I would say. And so all you're really doing is fiddling with the pump radius and rotational speed and choosing a material that can handle the forces involved while being fairly light and cheap. So that's what we've got here for our refueler. Another real straightforward one is ammo modules. Basically, if you build a weapon and you don't want to carry the ammo right with it in the turret or in the carrier module, you can build an ammo module that allows you to have it put it elsewhere in the ship. If it's explosive, maybe put it somewhere safer. So here, for example, is an ammo module for Nova missiles that I made. Nova missiles are one of my nuclear missile designs. Pretty good delta V on them. It's a missile with some drop tanks. And basically all you're doing is choosing capacity stacks to make it long and skinny versus short and squat. Give it some armor. You know, mostly you're going to deal with the armor by having the whole ship be armored, but giving a little bit of internal armor to it I think is worthwhile, so I put 3.5 centimeters of silicon nitride on it. It adds a little mass and a little bit of cost, but really most of the cost from this is from the uranium in the nukes. So that's ammo modules. Another straightforward one is going to be crew modules. So here's kind of like a baseline game crew module. You can see it's got 35 crew, it's got 5 decks, it's made of reinforced carbon-carbon with a shell of 3 centimeters thick. That's pretty good. You can see it's pretty expensive. There are some different things you can do to make a crew module either cheaper or better in different ways. Or you can just kind of resize it if you need a particular amount of crew in one module. So for example, here is the Cheapskate crew module, which is made of pure selenium. Now, hopefully they have some sort of plastic coating or a thin metal coating or something on the inside, because selenium reacts with air to make some very smelly compounds. So it's maybe not the best thing to encase your crew module in, but you can see it's very light, it's very cheap. Most of the cost for this is aluminum for like the internal workings of the crew module. And actually most of the mass is too. But this crew module will not stand up very well to impacts or spalling from impacts on the outside. So you can also make, a fancier crew module here. This one's quite expensive, you can see, but it's got 15 centimeters of titanium around it. So it's basically like an internal armor layer there. After anything gets through the other layers, it would have to break through, half a foot of titanium. So expensive, but arguably worth it. Another thing you can do, I don't know if it's really all that useful or not, to be honest, but something you can do here, like let me create a new one here to show you. So now you can't make it too small, by the way, because I think every crew module requires, it's something like 2 crew to operate. So if you were like, yeah, I'm going to make 1,000,000, 5 crew modules, that won't work very well, because 2/5 of your crew is going to be basically wasted operating the crew modules. So you're going to need something a little larger than that. But let's say that I have something here, a 50 crew module with 8 decks, kind of a standard model. And then what I can do is I can give it an outer shell that actually does some radiation shielding for me. So, for example, one that works fairly well while also being a decent material for this. You got boron carbide here. You give it, a 4 centimeter shell of boron carbide, and it gives it some of its own radiation shielding. You don't have to worry as much about shielding your reactor or adding in extraneous radiation shields. I think the ultra high molecular weight polyethylene is actually a good radiation shield too. That may be something to do with the way the game models things. I'm not sure how true that is in real life. Let's see, another one you could use, where did I put that? Titanium diboride, that's another one you can use. So, examples of things to play with crew modules. You can also, if you want to build some sort of insane space liner, you can have immense crew modules here. It would never be practical to have 800 crew in the game, but if you want to pretend you're building, a space cruise ship or something that has space for a ton of passengers, you can work with that sort of thing. So, along with that, another simple one is spacers here. Those are extremely simple. Basically, you're just deciding how long and how wide it is. And so, for example, you could build something. A lot of the time you use these just to make like a spike at the top of your ship so that it doesn't have a flat surface facing the enemy. So you could have something, 7 meters long. And sometimes you might want to make it a little wide too, because let's say you're trying to stick little engines around the sides of it as RCS. You don't want them to be interacting with each other and getting in each other's way. So you can make it with a pretty small radius here. I can do a 10 centimeter radius, so it's 7 meters by 20 centimeters. And this will just be just sort of a spot of empty space that I can stick onto part of my ship. Very straightforward. Also in there, let's see, you can build a cargo bay. This is basically just for role playing. Here's their base cargo bay. Here's a little one I made. And then there are radiation shields. So you can see they use polyethylene. Again, that might be an artifact of the game system that it works, as well as a radiation shield. It is light. You can see they're just different diameters. You can build your own of a separate diameter. I made one out of lead, just kind of to experiment with it. It's a lot heavier, so probably worse than these, but it works. And then another thing you can do with radiation shields is you can use them for not entirely the intended purpose and use them as weights or sort of armor-piercing points to a thing. So, for example, here's one that you could put as a weight in the front of a missile. It's made of osmium, densest material in the game. And it's, 8 centimeters by 20 centimeters. It weighs 90 kilos. You put this on the front of a missile, and it's got a very hard, sort of heavy front piece to smash into the enemy ship. So you can experiment with that sort of thing. Not the intended purpose of the radiation shield, but definitely is one that might be worthwhile. So that's most of the real simple baseline ones. I guess the next kind of level up of complexity would be the radiators here. So you can see the game comes with a bunch of different radiator designs of different materials. And you can also make your own. So for example, this is an example micro radiator that you might put on something like a little drone that has a very small radioisotope thermoelectric generator on it. It doesn't need to dissipate much heat at all. And so you put this little tiny fellow on here. It's as thin as it can be. It's a millimeter. It's made of silicon carbide. 10 centimeters tall. It's 20 centimeters wide. And that's all it is. Only weighs 142 grams. So you can stick this on a little drone or something without worrying about the weight cost of it. Then another thing you can do is sometimes you'll need a radiator that can deal with really high temperatures, higher than most of the base materials will allow. So I made this one here. This one's made out of zirconium carbide, which has a safe use temperature of 3600 Kelvin. So if you got something up here that was even, radiating out at 2800, 3000 Kelvin, it would still work. Whereas a lot of your radiators will just not operate at that temperature. And in general, if you can get that kind of high temperature as your waste heat, it's a lot more efficient to radiate it off. You can see this one I played with the tapering a little bit. You can give it a front taper, a back taper, give it this cool fin look. There's not usually much practical reason to do that, but it looks cool. And then you can make really big radiators if you're going to be using large quantities of, if you're going to be emitting real large quantities of heat. You can see this guy, if you got it to 2000 kilowatts or 2000 Kelvin, you could dissipate 1.2 gigawatts of heat off this guy. So that's pretty good. On the other hand, it costs 3.5 million credits and it weighs 203 tons. Now, part of that is that as kind of a sop to realism, I've made it a bit thicker than the baseline. It's 5 centimeters thick for the pipes in the middle with 4 centimeters of kind of an armor layer on each side of them. You don't actually have to do that. It makes the radiator a little bit more resilient. But there's nothing in the game that simulates, the G-forces just ripping the radiator off if you accelerate. So if you don't care about realism, you can shrink these down. You could also look for a cheaper material. I mean, silicon carbide's a pretty good cheap radiator material. Ceramic, not too heavy. 17.5 credits a kilo. It's a good baseline. You can give them a surface finish. It's mostly just for aesthetics. Um, but I mean, yeah, I can give it, this silicon surface finish. I think that basically the silicon's safe use temperature is a lot lower, so you wouldn't want to do that. But, you could give it a... again, that's not a very good safe use temperature. You could give it, a tungsten surface finish if you want it to look more metallic. And then there's one last thing you can do with radiators. I haven't really done very much with it. Um, uh, so I don't know how well this would work in practice, but it's an interesting concept. So here I've got this heat sink type radiator, where what I've done is I've made the radiator very thick. And so the idea is that it will take a long time for this radiator to become saturated with heat. It can act as a heat sink. So let's say you have a laser and you extend these radiators and they don't dissipate enough power. Let's say the laser operates at 1000 Kelvin and the laser produces, say, let's say 10 megawatts of waste heat, and you only have 4 of these radiators. So you're only able to dissipate, something like 3 megawatts of that heat. So in the long run, it's not going to work. But in the short run, it's going to take a long time for this radiator to fill up with heat, essentially, to act as a heat sink and become saturated to the full waste heat temperature. And so during that time, you can fire the laser, and you're just needing these little radiators that don't stick out very far, as opposed to the large radiator that you would need to fully dissipate the laser's heat. So honestly, I haven't really used that much. Just seems like a useful concept to play around with. There's another one here where I made it out of boron carbide because it's a pretty good material, works at pretty high temps. And it's got this nice fin look to it, which, it's nice and aesthetic. I like it. So that's radiators. Still pretty simple. And that's basically all the straightforward stuff. Like, just the most straightforward. So let's talk about propulsion. So the easiest type of propulsion to wrap your head around, at least for me, is just a basic combustion rocket. They give you a lot of baseline designs. You got these monoprop ones, you got these dual propellant ones of different sorts, and there are some other propellant combinations that are not used by the base game rockets that you can make for yourself. So, for example, the other nice thing with this is for working with size. So let's say that you need a tiny little rocket to power a tiny little missile, or even to act as RCS on a tiny little missile. And that's what this guy is here. This is a micro example combustion rocket. You can see it only weighs 38 grams. It's only 5 centimeters long. This is almost like a model rocket engine. The thrust is 20 newtons. And basically the idea with this is that you can see I've made it, as thin as possible, tiny little thing, powered by hydrogen peroxide, tiny little nozzle. The longer the nozzle, generally you'll get better exhaust velocity, but you're also making your engine heavier and larger. And so in this case, I'm essentially sacrificing exhaust velocity to make the thing very small. The injector, I could just stick with baseline aluminum. It's not under very much force. And I did not include a gimbal on this one because, again, this is an RCS engine you stick on the side of a little tiny missile or drone so that it can move itself around that way. And so, yeah, you can see I used the chamber contraction ratio to try and make the chamber wider and not as long. As you get the throat radius here larger, the chamber will naturally become sort of wider, and so you'll need a less extreme ratio here. Made of titanium so it can handle high temp and be fairly cheap and light. If you need to, if your rocket's getting too hot, you can use regenerative cooling, where you're kind of using the fuel pipes to cool the thing. The problem is this will create more thermal expansion stress, and some materials won't do very well with that. You kind of have to experiment with how much regenerative cooling you can build into your rocket while still having it all work. And you can experiment with different materials for sure. Let me pull up another example here. So that's the micro. Then here we have the mini, still hydrogen peroxide, about 10 times as much thrust or a little more. Better exhaust velocity, quite a bit heavier. And so this is kind of like for the back of your missile that we had before. And you can see it's basically the same design. So then we scale up to, let's say, the small rocket here. Now we're getting into something that you'd put on maybe a larger drone, and that also has a gimbal on it. So the gimbal is this part here that lets you sort of move the nozzle around to thrust. You can steer your ship either with, or your drone or whatever, with a gimbal, where you can have the thrust vector of the rocket engine move, and this lets you turn the ship, or with several of them you can spin the ship. Or you can use reaction control thrusters on the sides of the ship. And if you build, let's say a square ship, you could have 8 of them, and it allows you to spin the ship as well as turn it as well as nudge it side to side, up and down. And so either of those will work. You can even use them in combination. For missiles that are under a lot of G-forces, I find the RCS system works much better than the gimbals, because sometimes under high G-forces, or if the gimbal's kind of moving too fast, the ship will just break, or the gimbal will just break. It'll get stuck on, and then you run out of fuel and don't go anywhere near your target. So this one it's powered by propane and liquid oxygen, so it's slightly denser than methane. It's just kind of one step up on the chain of hydrocarbons. Better exhaust velocity. This measure here is the thrust to mass ratio. So that's basically how many, if the engine was by itself, how many G-forces would it pull? This one you can see I made out of tungsten to deal with higher temps. The gimbal here, you want to make your gimbal as small as possible. Usually for these I use momentum wheels, because they can sort of be powered by the engine itself, whereas electric actuators need to have separate electrical power, I think. For this one I just used iron because it's cheap and fairly heavy and holds together fairly well. So you just spin this thing at high speeds to create the flywheel that lets you steer your gimbal, basically. This up here is the stoichiometric ratio. So you can allow for higher density of propellants by including more of the denser propellant in there. You can also just kind of mess with it to try and get a higher exhaust velocity. Most of the time I don't really mess with the stoichiometry, but it's kind of an advanced thing that you can do. You can also see I've made the bell a lot longer in this one, and that's part of why the exhaust velocity is better. The other reason is because this is a bipropellant. So then we got the medium example here, which is also Propellox. Same exhaust. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong rocket. Okay, so this one is powered by RP1 and liquid oxygen, so Carolox, basically. This is a big enough rocket that you could stick a few of these on the back of a small to medium ship and it would power it fairly well. Although exhaust velocity, as you can see, is, not terrible, but nothing to write home about. If you really want a great exhaust velocity, you can do some decent stuff with hydrogen fluoride combustion. Just hopefully your engineers know how to contain the fluorine. But really, for the best exhaust velocities, you got to go with a nuclear rocket or even a Magnetoplasmadynamic Thruster, although I'm still not quite sure how to use those well for anything besides kind of role-playing with a long-distance cargo freighter. So as you can see, we've extended the bell further. We've got the gimbal. And let's see, what did I do for this one? This one I used hafnium carbide because it's one of the highest safe use temperatures in the game. 3962 Kelvin. So I basically wanted to allow this thing to operate at really high temperatures. That's why the whole thing kind of glows white when it's on there. And so that's really the example here. Also, using the RP1 gives the denser combustion or denser fuel. So the liquid oxygen is already reasonably dense. Now we've got the kerosene that's also reasonably dense. So you don't need as much space to carry your tanks in, so you have less space to cover with armor, so your ship can be lighter overall or have more armor. And then you can, of course, scale this up. So here I've got a really big one, which I'm actually using a modified ratio on. I did mess with the stoichiometry. This one by itself could power a fairly large ship. You could have a really big ship with like 3 of these in the back. And you can see I just reduced the stoichiometry a little bit so that there's a little bit less oxygen per unit of RP1, because as I recall, RP1 is denser than liquid oxygen. Let me just make sure that's the case and I didn't just do this for no reason. Let's see. So what if I pull up one of these tanks here? So oxygen has a density of 1140 kilograms per meter. Oh, and RP1 has a density of 769 kilos per meter. So, okay, there was no reason to actually mess with the stoichiometry for this rocket, aside from that it gives a good example. Really, what I should have done is try to pack more oxidizer in if I wanted to make it more efficient. But that's sort of my baseline combustion rocket designs. You can see I've made quite a few others. You've got the liquid oxygen butane concept here. You've got these ones running on ethylene oxide. And yeah, let me just, there's a lot of different concepts you can use, most of which I don't know how useful they would be. If you want to build something that's like a old-timey toxic fumes rocket, you can build something with white fuming nitric acid and hydrazine. I don't think the exhaust velocity is as good, but if you're kind of role-playing that you're building something from the early days of rocketry, you got your fluorine hydrogen. That's probably the best one out there. Methane liquid oxygen is pretty good. Hydrolox is pretty good. Then you got your baseline, monoprops like ethylene oxide, hydrogen peroxide, hydrazine, nitrous oxide, to allow you to use only one type of propellant. Now, a lot of those will be explosive if impacted, so you got to watch out for that. But moving on, we have our nuclear rockets here. So a nuclear rocket, basically, instead of burning the fuel together to make it hot and fly out the back, we run it through a nuclear reactor to make it hot and fly out the back. So we can use an inert propellant like helium. But we have to manage the fact that there's a nuclear reactor on there at the same time as our rocket engine. So, for example, I have this small methane nuclear thermal rocket, which you can see much better exhaust velocity, a bit heavier, does have a radiation hazard. Now you can mitigate all these things. So this is kind of the reactor. It's a fairly standard reactor, really. I think titanium diboride works pretty well for control rods. Graphite works well for moderator, unless you want to really go crazy with temperature anyway. Neutron reflector, there's a few different things you can use. You can use graphite, you can use boron carbide, you can use titanium diboride. Boron's a good one. For whatever reason, it's good at blocking neutrons, which are the worst kind of radiation, at least in this situation. The rocket is made of amorphous carbon, which I'm not really clear what amorphous carbon is supposed to be, but in the game, it's a very good material. It's got a really high safe use temperature, got pretty good yield strength. And so you can see it's basically like building a regular combustion rocket, except for you don't have to worry about how the combustion reaction works, and you do have to worry about bolting a nuclear reactor on it. So a lot of it is just, trial and error. Look at your example nuclear rockets and see what you want to change. And then you can see I've got this reflector here. If I wanted to worry more about radiation shielding, I can throw some more centimeters of titanium diboride on here. And I can cut that radiation down quite a bit. The problem is that it makes the ship a bit heavier, or the engine a bit heavier, so your thrust to mass ratio is a little worse. The good news is the reactor doesn't need to be flung around by the gimbals, so it doesn't affect my gimbal speed that I'm making the reactor more shielded. So that's nice. Actually, let's leave it like this. Now it's only, instead of a milliwatt, it's 101 microwatts, so 1/10 of what it was before. This should basically allow you to bolt these on your ship without worrying about radiation shielding. Alright, so that's sort of a small scale design with methane. Methane's a good one to work with. It's kind of the classic. Um, Another example here I made with helium. It actually doesn't have quite as good um, thrust to mass ratio, nor does it have quite as good exhaust velocity, but it's still pretty good. And helium's an interesting one to kind of experiment with. Let's see how the density compares with methane. Okay, yeah. Not great, honestly. Just kind of more of an experimental thing, really. Um, but basically the same concept as before. The reactor's a little larger, has more material, has a larger neutron flux. This is really the main thing that represents how powerful your reactor is. I mean, the amount of fuel you have matters, but this is kind of your power slider for how much nuclear fire you want to have. And so it's an important thing to work with. You can see with these, you want to have a really long nozzle so that you get a good exhaust velocity. At least that's what I think anyways. You're trying to max exhaust velocity with these guys. So that's that one. And then I do have an example here of you can build one out of water or using water. You're not going to get a good exhaust velocity, but it's a fairly dense propellant. And for role playing, it's something that you can find in a lot of places in the solar system. Icy asteroids, the rings of Saturn, icy moons of the outer planets, Earth. So it has a certain role playing interest there to make your rocket run on water. And then what I have here is an example very high specific impulse nuclear thermal rocket. You can see I've really taken the Bell to an extreme, and more importantly, we're using straight hydrogen. And so it's going to have a lot of propellant. Uh, it's going to have a lot of space that it takes up with the propellant tanks. But, 9.40 kilometers per second, if you want something that can really cross the vast gulfs of space, this is pretty good. So really you're just playing with, the nozzle. You're playing with either the chemical reaction or the nuclear reaction and what you're using to power the thing. And it's usually a bit of a trade-off between propellant density and specific impulse, usually. So then we've got Resistojets. I don't think there's that much use for them, honestly. Basically, instead of powered by a nuclear reaction or a chemical reaction, you're making the stuff hot that you're shooting out the rocket engine by basically running a hot coil that you run electricity through to make it hot. So it's basically like a space heater almost. Space heater. But yeah, that's basically what you've got here. So this guy, I do like the blazing wall of fire that it generates for having only 50 kilonewtons of thrust. That's pretty cool. But, it takes 700 megawatts. It's only producing 50 kilonewtons. Not even a great exhaust velocity. The advantage is it's using xenon, which is very dense. So you can see here, it's like 3 times as dense as water, our xenon that we've got stored here. Maybe it's liquefied. And everything's got to be really high temp resistant because it's basically all about temp with this. You got your coils made of hafnium carbide, and you just kind of see how much power you can run through them, and then how much fuel you can run through that, and try to balance those things. Some of the base game ships use Resistojets as RCS. I have never really seen that much use for the Resistojets, but I was able to get this one using water to have extremely high exhaust velocity, 5 kilometers per second, which is better than the baseline or my water nuclear thermal rockets. So that's pretty good. But it takes 30 megawatts to produce 90 kilonewtons of thrust, so power-wise, it's probably not that useful. There is, from what I've heard, a bug with Resistojets where you can get them to be more than 100% efficient. Um, Seems like they're still not all that useful even with the bug, but could be fun to experiment with. And then lastly, we have Magnetoplasmadynamic Thrusters. So basically, these ones, you're generating a powerful electromagnetic field, I think, and basically shooting ions out the back. And so you get very high exhaust velocity, but very low thrust. This is essentially, it's like a fancy ion. It's like a scaled up ion engine, I would say. Um, Souped up a bit so that you can actually use it to power a decent sized ship with a decent amount of acceleration, although it's still going to be tiny acceleration. You're still going to be running this with burns for days on end to get anywhere. But you can make some stuff that, you can see this baseline one they did has an exhaust velocity of 24.3 kilometers per second. I made this one here using argon, so its fuel is a little denser. And honestly, I kind of just had to experiment a little bit here to get this to work. You can see here the velocity is going down. I can try bringing it up, but it'll start using more and more power. And at a certain point, I was thinking it's going to break somehow. Let's see. Yeah, okay, that produces onset phenomenon, and it starts breaking uh, eroding the thruster itself. But yeah, I can get this up to 25 clicks per second, 10 kilonewtons. Uses 141 megawatts, so even just power carrying the reactor and the fuel tank around, this isn't going to go very fast. But with that kind of exhaust velocity, you can get, solar system crossing ships fairly easily. It's just they won't go very fast. And this thruster is quite small. You can see it's less than a meter in all dimensions. It's probably a little over a foot by a little over a foot by about a foot. Looks like so. It's pretty small. You can try messing with the scale. You can see I've got that exhaust velocity going up, for now anyway. But the power use is also going way up. So yeah, honestly, a lot of this for me is just trial and error still. But you want, a resistive material, so an insulator like silicon carbide, two conductive materials, so I use tungsten and copper. So yeah, I would say I haven't really done much experimentation with these. They're never going to be great for the main propulsion of a warship in combat, but for traveling long distances, it could be useful to work with. So that's propulsion. Next up, let's look at weaponry. There's quite a few different weapon concepts we have to go over. The simplest would be the conventional gun. This is basically, a souped up version of a cannon, even going way back to, Age of Sail ships almost. I mean, this is more like a modern tank gun, but still, it's the same basic concept. You've got something, an explosive material, propels a projectile through the expansion of gases out the end of the barrel, and then you've got a turret to move the barrel around. So you can do these on different scales. So this is one I built for putting on small drones. You can see it only weighs about 50 kilos. It only fires, its caliber is only 10 millimeters here. So it's basically firing like pistol rounds It's firing them pretty fast for that, 1.5 kilometers per second. And it fires one every frame, so under 33 milliseconds means it's going to fire once per frame. Takes 370 watts to power the whole thing. That's the 350 for the linear motor plus 20 for the turret motors. And you can see for this I used titanium. I gave it some barrel armor of reinforced carbon-carbon because it's light and helps conduct waste heat away. If you don't have to worry about the structural integrity of your barrel armor, if you're just using it to radiate heat, graphite can actually work really well. Grain radius, basically, if you want to slow down how fast your propellant is burning, you increase the grain radius. That way it doesn't break your gun when it goes off. It creates more of a slow burn. Well, it's still an explosion, but it's a slower explosion that will allow the thing to launch without breaking. Loader represents how fast you're reloading the thing. Which, let's see, it should tell me that somewhere. Okay, for this one, it's just, that's the reload time. It's just entirely based on this. You can see I can shrink it down. Or I can make it run on less energy, but then it's not going to reload as fast. So typically you're going to give this a turret, although with a real small drone, you could give it just an external mount and have it just bolt onto the front of the drone, swing around. But I gave it a little turret. Usually you want to make your turret extruded. If you don't, it's like a little ball turret and it can't rotate with the same firing angle. So you see this can only go within 51 degrees. This can go up to 90 degrees, so it can go all the way over to the side. You can use electric actuators or momentum wheels. Generally, the electric actuators will use less power, in my experience, than momentum wheels. You can choose what kind of magnets you use for them. Typically, you just want to go with the neodymium iron boron. Give the thing the best power for mass ratio, even though it's a bit more expensive. This one has an attached ammo bay. 2,000 shots, so it's got plenty of shots to go a long way. This represents how many stacks is the ammo bay, so I can make it really long and skinny. I can make it really short and squat. And then here it tells you what it shoots at. So ships, shots, I want it to fire at both. Bolt this on a little drone, send a swarm of them at the enemy, and even though it's just firing these little 5-gram chunks of tungsten, it'll eventually kind of sandblast the enemy ship down pretty well. Tracer represents the tracer bullets you're putting in there to give it the color of the shot. So, for example, it's kind of like fireworks logic if you know what colors are used in fireworks. So, copper will make this nice green, looks like a Imperial laser from Star Wars. Let's see, sulfur makes this nice yellow. What are some other good ones? Strontium will make good purple. Well, that's sort of purple anyway. More greens with copper. And let's see. Ooh, that's a beautiful blue with samarium there. I'm going to stick with that, like that. So you can even like color code your ship this way, if you have its different armaments firing with different colors. And that way you can tell at a glance what's firing and how it's doing. So now let's say we scale this up to more of a small cannon. This is firing 30 millimeter projectiles that weigh 20 grams. And it's firing them even faster, 2.2 kilometers per second. For a gun on Earth, that's quite good. But in space, you're going to get outstripped by railguns and coilguns pretty easily. You can see I kept it under 1 frame still. This is representing the impact energy of each projectile, that 42 kilojoules versus this was 5.47. And then here, I've got a large example cannon. This is firing 90 millimeter, 500 gram projectiles, so half a kilo in each one. It does only fire 15 times a second, and it requires, quite a bit more electricity, 440 kilowatts in total. And the other problem with this is you start having to worry about an impact to this detonating the magazine and causing a bunch of trouble to your ship. These could be a decent armament for a fairly cheap ship that's meant to get in close quickly and then open fire with conventional guns. In general, conventional guns are going to be outranged and outstripped by coilguns and railguns. And they're not going to have the same anti-missile capacity as a laser. But there's still a place for them in the game. Using too many of them on your ship will result in the solar system turning into a slideshow and lag taking over. But you can see for this one I made it out of vanadium chromium steel. That's pretty much the strongest material in the game. I needed that to deal with the forces here. I made the projectiles out of osmium, densest material in the game. And it requires a big turret and a lot of electricity to move the thing around. The turret also has 10 centimeter of boron filament that's to deal with magazine explosions to some extent. Hopefully the ammo here is protected by the thick armor of the turret. Boron filament is a pretty good in a pinch armor for a lot of things. It's kind of brittle, so you got to worry about that. But it's fairly light, fairly cheap, very good yield and tensile strength. So I like it for an armor material, depending on what you're armoring against. So that's conventional guns. You can kind of just take a conventional gun here and mess with it, and you'll get something to work without too much trouble. I haven't been able to get a gun like this to work that fires, 1-ton projectiles in any sort of practical sense. It would be fun to have a ship that worked like this. I don't think it's practical. So then we've got railguns here. And railguns are about shooting small projectiles very fast. So this guy here fires a 2-gram round. Let's see. So every 4 frames. So 7.5 times a second. But you can see it fires it at 10.8 kilometers per second. And so because of that, the impact energy of these little 2-gram projectiles is 116 kilojoules. This is what you might call a sandblaster type weapon. It works at high range because it's so fast, in part, harder to dodge against. And it won't break through maybe the heaviest armor, but it will definitely sort of strip off a Whipple shield, damage any not heavily armored enough turrets or anything like that, and really thoroughly blast the outside of your ship. And if the Whipple shield on your ship is damaged, then it can actually start to break those inner armor layers too. So for this one, I use zirconium copper for the rails. It's maybe not, I think it's honestly the best material. There are other materials you can play with. You want something that's strong and also very conductive of electricity. And you can see zirconium copper. Let me add conductivity to this list here. This is something you'll work with a lot in module design. You can look at different material properties and you can sort by them once you put them in. So here's electrical conductivity. You can see the only thing stronger than it in terms of conductivity are copper and silver, and both of those have much weaker tensile and yield strength. Nothing else really has the same combination here. To get something with stronger tensile and yield strength than this, you got to sacrifice a lot of conductivity. So zirconium copper is what I've mostly used for my railguns. And what you can do with your railguns and coilguns is you can either have them just powered straight off the source here, in which case they'll fire very fast but will require a huge amount of power, or you can stick a capacitor on there And by messing with the size of the capacitor, you can determine how much electricity it stores. Sometimes you can use the separation to make the capacitor work a little better. It looks like if I take this up just to here, I can get it another 100 meters per second out of it. And for capacitor composition, most of the time you want to use hafnium. It's definitely the most energy dense of the materials. Sometimes, you can experiment with mica. Um, but in general, you can't go wrong with hafnia in my experience. Just makes the capacitor so small, it just hides in there and doesn't get in the way. You should be able to use multiple capacitors. Unfortunately, there seems to be a bug with that. It doesn't work very well. The barrel armor is basically to hold the rails together, give them extra strength. That's why I'm using this boron filament here. Conductivity on the armor doesn't matter because the electricity flows through the rails. And then the armature is the projectile. I'm using vanadium chromium steel because I need something that can handle a whole ton of force. Another thing you can use is osmium because I believe only the ultimate tensile strength matters. It doesn't matter to the game if it gets stretched out a bit. And osmium has a really good ultimate tensile strength. And osmium has a really good ultimate tensile strength. You need something that's somewhat conductive at least too, which, steel is fairly conductive. It's not the best, but it's not an insulator. Loader represents how fast we're loading the projectiles in, but in the case of this gun, the reload time of a new projectile is only 8 milliseconds. Most of the time is spent charging the capacitor. So that's most of the time for the reload is spent charging this up. So I could make it reload faster if I put more megawatts into it. If I powered this up with, say, if I turned this up to, say, 7 megawatts here. All right, let's try and get this under 33. So now it can fire once a frame. In 2 minutes, 30 seconds, it would overheat and only be able to fire once every 3 frames or so. But I can, jack up the size of the barrel armor here, get that reload down. But now I would need to have a much larger turret to run this thing with all the extra weight I've added to it. And I'm going to need something that can handle better under strain than iron does. So let's say we switch those out for tungsten. And let's drop the power on these momentum wheels, see if we can still get a decent turning speed. Okay, so you can see now we've got it to fire once a second, but it's using 7 times as much electricity. It's heavier, and it's a larger sort of target on the side of the ship. So there's always trade-offs, basically, is the point of that. It's got a turret. For this turret, I'm using aramid fiber as the armor. That's sort of a variant of Kevlar. It's really good against lasers. I think there's a cap to the ablation of each material that's part of the base game. If you edit that out, different materials become better at obstructing lasers, but in the base game, aramid fiber is one of the best. UHMWPE fiber, also pretty good. Both of these are quite expensive, but they're also quite light. And for armoring just a turret, it's not terrible. You can see it's my biggest cost here, but it's only 138,000 credits. So on the scale of most ship designs, unless you're trying to go super cheap, that's survivable. So I'm not going to save my changes for this one, but that's my concept for a small railgun. And really, you have to keep your railguns small for them to work well. You're not going to be sending downrange like kilogram level projectiles with a railgun. So we got the large example railgun here. Fires 6 times a second, but it's firing a 30-gram round even a little bit faster, 11 kilometers per second. So therefore, each projectile impacts with 1.82 megajoules. Now it requires 57.5 megawatts to run the whole thing. It's much larger. It's more expensive. But you can see it's basically the same concept as the previous one. It's just scaled up. Really, that's all we did for this is scaled up the old design to get this to work. And honestly, I mean, I am not the best designer out here. You can probably figure out tricks to get a railgun to shoot, 30 kilometers per second with base game materials. You start throwing in modded materials, you can probably get to 100 kilometers per second and really start blasting at range. But this is a pretty good one. Better than any of the stock railguns, in my opinion. And you can see we've lost a little bit of efficiency. The other one was 48% efficient. This one's only 25%. You kind of just take that penalty when you scale up, as far as I can tell. This one, the main cost is actually the electric actuators here, the neodymium iron boron. Although the UHMWP fiber armor is also pretty expensive. So I could, cheap out on this. I could use less armor. I could use cheaper armor. I could use a cheaper magnet type here. Let's see. What's one that's still okay? What if I went with samarium cobalt? And then I scaled this up. And then let's say instead of this, I used boron filament. And then let's say that I was okay with reducing the turning speed. So now you can see I've almost cut the cost in half. I've sacrificed the defensibility of the gun and a bit of the turning speed. But you can see you can make it a lot cheaper. If cost is your factor, you can deal with that. If mass is your factor, you can mess with that. There's a lot of things you can do to change these around. But basically, you're never going to fire a huge projectile. Maybe 100 grams is probably the biggest you're going to fire reasonably out of a railgun, and even that's a stretch. Really, it's more like, the 1 gram to like 30 grams range. So let's say you want to fire a larger projectile fast. You can use coil guns, which, instead of having these two rails, it's got these coils and uses magnetic fields. So here's a small example coil gun. Shoots a 4-gram round, not quite as fast as the other one, 3 times a second. And you can see I experimented with a different capacitor. That's why the capacitor's so big. Generally just stick with hafnium. Armature, gotta use magnetic metal glass. Nothing else compares. That's just what you gotta use for these. And the coil for this one, I'm using this ferritic stainless steel. I want something to create a large magnetic field. So iron like this is pretty good for that. And yeah, it uses bismuth momentum wheels. Bismuth is pretty cheap and quite heavy, so it works well as a momentum wheel. Well, except for it increases the mass, of course. You can see most of the mass of this is that probably propylene from the capacitor. So again, stick with hafnium. Nice thing about coil guns is they can have this tiny little spread, so you can start firing all your shots down the same line and kind of drilling through armor, because they don't have the same spread that a lot of your weapons will have. And you can see the bore radius is very narrow. It's 1 millimeter. Firing these little 4-gram slivers. But the nice thing with a coil gun is you can actually scale it up. So we got this guy here. Fires almost as fast for the shots, although it fires less than 3 a second. It's firing 400-gram chunks. So each one impacts with 11.6 megajoules of force. That's pretty good. That's a heavy heavy impact for any ship to deal with. And I think I actually mislabeled the reload time. This should be like 16F because it's firing every 16 frames. So you can see it's kind of just a scaled up version of the other one. I think for coil materials, you can experiment with some other materials. I'm trying to think what people have used that look good. Zirconium copper might be worth a shot. Let's see what else might be good. Maybe hafnium carbide. Um, maybe magnetic metal glass. I honestly, yeah, coil guns. There's a lot of stuff that I don't really know yet. That there's definitely room to experiment with. You can see because it's not quite as fast, the range is not quite as far. But again, the spread is very small. This will blast a long way. The graphite there is to deal with overheating. It's kind of a heat sink slash radiator. So now another thing you can do with the weapons here, it's usually easiest to do it with the conventional gun, but you can do it with other things too. So they even did it in the base game here. This isn't a great example, but you can make it fire payloads that aren't just a chunk of metal. So let me save this as a copy so that I can look at it here. So what this is doing is it's firing. So it's got these little 1 gram sabots here, basically, that fire out. It's got a very wide bore, 23.3 centimeters. And what it's doing is it's firing basically 40 kilogram chunks of high explosive with a detonator in them. And so you can fire inert explosive payloads, you can fire nukes out of one, or you can fire little missiles out. And the nice thing there is, your missile already starts with a fast starting velocity, so it has less need to accelerate. And so for sort of a close-in missile weapon, for when your ship is actually engaging the enemy and you want it to send out a flurry of little missiles to distract them and maybe do some damage, that can work really well. There's probably limits to how big you can make it, but you could do that. If it's not too big, you can do it with a coil gun. In theory, you could probably do it with a railgun. I don't think that's very practical. But coil gun launched or conventional gun launched projectiles can be pretty useful for that. So then we've got, let's see, that's not really a projectile weapon, so we'll come back to that. Then we've got missile launchers and drone launchers here. So for example, this thing is here, launches our little cannon drones. Which, let me show you what those look like so that you can see what the payload of this guy is. So this is an example gun drone I built basically out of example parts. You can see it has the little micro radiators, it has the drone gun on the front. It has the propane oxygen engines. So the small example combustion rockets on the back. It's got 3 of them. They're gimbaled. And it uses our example micro radioisotope thermoelectric generator that I haven't showed you yet. So this is our example little gun drone. It can go pretty far, 3 kilometers per second delta V. And it's not too big. It's, how heavy is it? It's like 3 tons. So you could put a lot of these on a ship without too much trouble. And so going back to module design, you need something to launch these. And you can use a blast launcher, but commonly you would use just a little carrier module like this. Generally for these, for the stator, I usually stick with cobalt. You can experiment a bit. Track length will make it stick out more, but will allow it to fly out of the end a little faster. The forcer is electrically conductible or conductive material. You can use silver, you can use copper, you can use zirconium copper. Any of those are good choices. Coolant, I just used water. The turbo pump for the coolant, I used titanium. Gave it a little bit of boron filament. For this one, I attached its own ammo bay. You can also use an ammo module separate if you don't want to have an attached ammo bay here. That can make it stick out of the ship less because this all kind of has to bolt onto your ship. Engagement range is for if you want to use it actually in combat, if you want to start flinging off ship stuff while you're in combat with the enemy, as opposed to launching them when you're still out in deep space and sending them to intercept. So this one doesn't have that. And yeah, basically the power use comes from the motor for powering the electrical launch fraction here, and also the coolant turbo pump, and you kind of got to balance both to get a good reload here. This one can fire once every 724 milliseconds, so about once every 3/4 second. And it operates at 1,000 Kelvin. Having it operate hot is pretty good because it means that you can use more radiators, or it means your radiators will be more efficient. And so you can save on radiator surface area. So I also made one to fire these little micro flak missiles that are much smaller. You can see it fires one of those every 2 frames, every 64 milliseconds. Requires a lot less power because it's just firing little tiny micro flak missiles. So for this one, because it's a lot smaller, I did actually splurge on neodymium iron boron here for the stator. Because it's all so small that I can afford to do that. Again, it has ammo bay. So this is here to pop out, swarms of little microflak missiles. Which, let me show you what the microflak missile looks like. So this is an example, a little tiny missile that I made. 32 kilos, about 1 meter long. Runs on hydrogen peroxide, has about 2 kilometers per second of delta V. Really, for a flak missile, you might want more delta V than that. I should probably redesign this with a bipropellant engine to give it more delta V. But for an example, this works pretty well. And it's got, on the front of it, this little flak bomb here that will go off and blast the enemy ship with flak. Now, when you're designing these, you want to be careful because the flak will disappear after 1 frame. So you want to have the detonation point and the enemy ship be less than 1 frame apart. So you look at your crossing vector, your closing speed with the enemy ship in kilometers per second. And then you got to divide that by 30. And that distance you get is how far away from the ship your detonation point can be. It's got to be within that, or your flak's going to be deleted before it can hit the enemy ship, which is annoying, but such is life. This one, you can see it uses those little tiny example engines. The mini example on the back, micro example is RCS. And that way it can pull these high G forces without having the gimbal break, because it doesn't have any gimbals. So another way you can launch things if you don't want to have to spend electrical power on them is you can build a blast launcher. So like for example here, this will launch 20 microflak missiles in quick succession, 1 every millisecond, or 1 every frame. They'll each fly off at 48 meters per second, and basically they're just being blasted out by an explosive, just going off like a chain of fireworks. And so you got to use something pretty dense for your arm, or pretty sturdy for your arm material. If I tried to do this with, let's say I was like, I'm going to use aluminum, it just won't work. Even if the walls got as thick as they could, they won't work. Or if I try something a little better, like selenium, it works, but I've got a ton of extra mass here. So you need something that's real strong, like this ultra high molecular weight polyethylene, or as I had before, good old fashioned boron filament. Now the blast walls don't have to be so heavy. You can see this is set to go off at 40 kilometers. So you stick these on the side of the ship. At 40 kilometers, they all go off, and suddenly you have a swarm of missiles going towards the enemy. And so, yeah, that's blast launchers. They can be useful to do kind of a missile bus design. Um, I have this one, for example, the Sky Blossom missile bus. So this has 4 blast launchers of each type that are firing 2 different types of micro missiles. So this is like a drone, got a lot of delta V. You send this towards the enemy at high speed, and then as it comes in, once it reaches the target distance, these all blast out. All of a sudden, you have a ton of little missiles flying towards the enemy. They've been given a bunch of speed by the missile bus here. This has been able to burn to give them all speed. It's almost like a staging design. And so that way, you can get these guys to fly a lot faster, which is generally good. So, now that we've looked at that, I think next would be lasers. Lasers, I have to admit, I'm still kind of figuring out. I I mostly still just have to start with a baseline laser and edit it. I'm not that great at making them by myself. But here's a small example laser. Uses 8 megawatts of power. Lasers are going to take a lot of power. You just have to accept that if you're going to work with them. And this one, you can see it's got krypton, it's got borosilicate glass. It tells you what everything should be here. It's like, this is where you're generating the photons. This should be transparent to said photons. This should be reflective to the photons. This is your coolant. It should also be transparent. Generally, you want to try and make this as round as possible while still having these 2 parts separate. So that's why it's 1.8 meters by 1.74. The gain medium, this one works pretty well. Ruby works pretty well. And neodymium and GGG seems to work pretty well. The other ones I haven't really found a use for yet. Well, let me look, actually. There might be another one that's useful. Okay, titanium sapphire, that works too. The ones that aren't used here, I have not really been able to figure out a great example of. I mean, here's one with erbium silica that works okay. And then you gotta cool the thing, of course. You run it as hot as you can. Mirror's got to be reflective. Output coupler, you kind of just have to experiment with because it's going to be semi-reflective. And then aperture radius, making this wider will make the laser more powerful, but it will also make the turret easier to shoot off for your enemies. It'll make it more of a target. Generally, you want to leave this thing unmounted and then build separate turrets for it. You can build it with a turret sticking out of it, but it's better to have a whole bunch of turrets because those turrets are going to get shot off. You want to have spares. They're the cheap part. The laser's the expensive part. So you build a bunch of turrets. You can put frequency doublers on, which will cost a little bit of efficiency, but will let you get a higher wavelength, which will generally do more damage. Also, it can allow you to make your laser pretty colors. So this one's in the near infrared, so it's going to be invisible, and is not going to do as much damage for a given amount of intensity as one that's been frequency doubled. You can see here we get our total efficiency. Most of these you can see are pretty good. The problem is that the pumping is not great. That's the fundamental problem, is your lasers are not going to be very efficient. Maybe an overall efficiency of 5% is maybe the best you're ever going to get without mods. And so that's just something you have to deal with. There's a lot of your energy in this is going to be dumped away as heat. You're going to have a lot of radiators. That's just the sacrifice you make for having a laser, which the advantage of is it's instantaneous. And so it doesn't really have to worry about missing its target. It can just burn straight away at a target. And the main problem with it is just that the beam slowly decoheres and attenuates over distance. And so you can see the intensity keeps going down as we go farther out. But, you know, it can fire at 1,000 kilometers. It's just that it's not very strong. So then you can scale this guy up. You can make a large laser. And this one you can see I made it really long so that I can have the lasing rods be really long. Makes it more efficient, but makes it, of course, heavier. You kind of bolt this on the side of a ship, have it go a long way down the spine of a ship. And this guy's using titanium sapphire, which is what the base game 100 megawatt laser uses. It's a pretty good one. Using xenon, using diamond for its envelope. So this is, you know, fairly expensive and fairly long. You can see it's 55 meters long. But that means we can get the pumping efficiency real high, which means it's okay if we sacrifice some by using a double frequency doubler here. Oh, wow, I really should have figured that out. That makes it a lot more efficient. So now we got this double frequency doubler, and we're basically not losing any efficiency there. We do lose a bit on the focusing mirror, because we got this ultraviolet beam that's harder to reflect and focus properly. But we've got an invisible near ultraviolet laser of 160 megawatts power going into it. And you can see that intensity is pretty strong. Even at 100 kilometers out, that's still pretty good. So if you have, say, incoming missiles coming against this, they're going to have to go pretty fast to get through this before it can destroy them, burn through them. I've got it set to a 50-kilometer engagement range. I could probably even set it further. But yeah, basically, lasers just kind of have to experiment with. In my experience for frequency doublers, potassium titanyl phosphate is beautiful, works great. And yeah, just messing with the dimensions of things until you get the most efficiency out of it here. Get all these numbers looking good. Try for a round cavity. See about how long you can make it. Mess with the size of the lasing rods and the arc lamp. Generally, bigger laser used to have wider aperture, but to some extent, it's up to you. And then for your laser, you gotta have a laser mount. So your laser mount, you can give it your momentum wheels or electric actuators. It's not going to need that much power to be able to turn real fast. Because it's not having to move a whole cannon around. It's just having to move basically a mirror. And so you got to build a turret wide enough to fit it. You got to put some good armor on your turret. You tell it what to target. And yeah, designing laser mounts is pretty easy. And then you just bolt a bunch of these all over your ship. And use them to target enemy ships. So that's basically all of the weapon types here. The next thing we would talk about is ordnance here. So you can build a few different things. You can build a flare. Basically, these you'll shoot out of a blast launcher typically. I think you'd even bolt one onto a missile and have it fly and burn. And the idea here is that you launch these out of the ship, and the incoming missiles get distracted by these, chase them instead of your ship. And so you need something that burns, ideally burns significantly brighter than your ship and for a long period. But of course, the way to do that is mostly by, you increase the delay composition here to make it burn slower, but also weaker. You can see it's a lot less powerful than it used to be, but it burns twice as long. Or we go the other way. Now it burns over a gigawatt, but it only runs for 2.52 seconds. And then if you want to just make the thing last longer and be brighter, you can, of course, scale it up here. But now it's heavier, it's more expensive. takes up more space, all sorts of problems. So it's just kind of that balancing act of how you make a good flare. Depends on what kind of ships, what your ship's heat signature is, which is a reason maybe to try and have your ship be lower power. So then we've got different sort of explosive modules. So we've got this one here. This is just a straight chunk of high explosive. You got the detonator here. If you leave this at 0, it'll try to detonate on impact with the ship. This is when it sort of wakes up. This keeps it from blowing up your own ships. And this is, you can set an override timer to blow it up if it flies for too long, kind of to reduce lag. Now the other thing you can do is you can start with the explosive warhead. You can put a bunch of dense material around it and create a flak bomb. So this one here, you can see it's going to fire 264-gram chunks of shrapnel, 944 of them. And I've set it to detonate at 70 meters out. So 70 times 30. So if it's going faster than 2.1 kilometers per second relative to its target, the flak should hopefully actually hit its target. Flak weapons are a little bit unreliable, but when they work really well. You can make them really small, you can make them really big. This is kind of medium. And then the other thing you can build are nukes. And so you got here, this is like trying to make one really small, probably smaller than you could in real life, hopefully anyway, because that's pretty small. It's made with, you can choose different materials here. There's different costs and things. You got a fast explosive, a slow explosive. You want to keep this as high as possible, typically. And then you can try and fill the inside with fusion fuel to get a boost. And the detonator settings just like before. As a warning, these will make a really bright flash and be kind of obnoxious if you have a bunch going off, especially if you have them like flying in series. You get a strobe effect, pretty annoying. Unless you enjoy turning your computer into an impromptu, discotheque. You can make them pretty big, like this guy here. About 10 megatons is about as big as I've ever gotten one. Probably with mods, you can make something larger. Now, you might think you could just cluster a bunch of these on one missile. That creates a bug where it honestly works too well. Sometimes it'll automatically teleport to inside the enemy ship and blow it up. So that can be kind of fun, but is maybe not realistic. And that's Ordnance. So the last thing we have to talk about is, in some ways, the most important, the power plant for your ship. So there's kind of a couple different things you can do. You can build a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, where basically radioactive material gets hot and that heat is used on a thermocouple to generate electricity. Space probes will use this sometimes in real life. So this is an example, a little tiny one here. You can see it weighs like a kilo. It powers only 101 watts. So, an old school incandescent light bulb. But for a small thing, it works pretty well. There's a lot of different materials you can use for your radioisotope thermoelectric generator. Most of them don't work very well. This one I'm using actinium because from what I've been told, it's the best one that doesn't break realism in a lot of crazy ways. So Cobalt 60 works better, but is horrifyingly radioactive, and using it at any scale would probably just kill your whole crew being around it, assuming there's any crew on your ship. Curium 242 works great. Good safe use temperature and everything too, but the argument I saw was that this has too short a half-life, and so you couldn't use it in real life. for curium-242. Polonium-210 seems good, but that safe use temperature of 500 Kelvin is going to mean you're going to have to run a real low operating temperature, and it's just not going to work great. Tritium, impossible to use because the safe use temperature is 20 Kelvin. I don't think this system even lets you use that as an outlet temperature. So, literally impossible without mods, unfortunately. So, you got this here, your little fuel pellet. You can kind of change its height, extend it. It reduces the fuel temperature. In this case, I've made it as thin as possible because the fuel temperature is pretty good there. You got your thermocouple. So for this, you got to look at where is it here? Thermoelectric sensitivity. And you want a big difference between these numbers. So you can see here there's gadolinium on one side, selenium on the other. Non-metals don't really seem to work for this. So like I've tried with silicon or diamond, it just doesn't seem to work. And so you got to find a good combination of this that has decent tensile strength and also has decent temperature tolerance, depending on what you're doing. So for this one, I've got one side with nickel, chromium, iron, thermoelectric sensitivity of 20. I've got one side with tungsten rhenium, thermoelectric sensitivity of negative 14.2. That's a big difference, makes this efficient. Increasing the length of the thermocouple will result in more power generation. Eventually, though, it will cause thermal expansion stress to break your materials. Exit temperature, want this as high as possible, given the other limitations. Coolant, I just used water and made a little tiny turbo pump. So that's the smallest little RTG there. I mean, you could make smaller, but this is about the smallest practical. This is one that you can stick a few together and use as backup power for your crew module on your ship, or to power some very small weapons in case the reactor gets hit. You can see it's a bit larger. It's a bit more expensive. The nice thing with this actinium is it doesn't produce any sort of radiation hazard for the crew. You can see the exit temperature is lower for this one, only 700 Kelvin. So it is going to need a little bit more radiator space. But again, I mean, it's just not a very power heavy thing. It's only producing 15 kilowatts of heat. So you're not going to need that much radiator space. So you can scale these up a little bit. I mean, you can see this one here from the stock game produces 105 kilowatts, but it also costs 3 million credits. So what you want to start doing is you want to move into proper nuclear reactors. And for these, I definitely took a look at the base designs, especially this base design, because there's an operating temp of 2000, whereas these are all much lower operating temps, much less efficient. So I definitely took this one as a baseline example for some of my designs. So here's a medium reactor, 10 megawatts of power, outlet temp of 2300 kelvins, 337 microwatts of radiation hazard, so under a milliwatt, which is where I try to keep it. And yeah, this is like for the design for the nuclear thermal rockets, except for it's just for a reactor. So I'm using a sodium coolant. You can use heavy water. You can use regular water. But I mean, sodium is what they've used in like experimental reactors, crazy high temps, so it made sense to me. Mess with the enrichment if you want. Graphite's a good moderator. A very high safe use temperature. Titanium diboride is good too. Inner turbo pump has to be able to survive real high temperatures. So that's why I'm using titanium carbide here. Your thermocouple, if you make it wider, it'll be able to survive more more power going through it without the same thermal expansion problem. Same if you make it longer, but then of course you're making your whole thing larger. And for this, I'm using tungsten osmium because it's not a huge gap in thermoelectric sensitivity, so it's not quite as efficient as some other combinations, but it allows for a very high operating temperature. And high operating temperature means less radiator space, which is all to the good. Outer coolant, I'm just using water. You can experiment with that. And you can see it's got a little model of the whole thing. Your reactor, your inner turbo pump, your thermocouple, your outer turbo pump, your waste heat, and how many kilowatts you're spending on your turbo pumps, which compared to the output of this is not very much, thankfully, because these will cut into your output. This represents sort of the range of the reactor. You deal with this by messing with the moderators and the control rods. So you can see if I take out these control rods, the thing's going to try and go supercritical. Not good. Or if I throw in way too much stuff here, well, it can't fit for one thing. No, I was trying to make it go into subcritical. Maybe if I reduce the neutron flux here. Nope. Okay, well, if I make it really tall, yeah, you can see now it doesn't become critical anymore. So you can also scale a reactor up quite a bit. This one, it's large. You can see it's 153 tons, 6 million credits, but it produces 431 megawatts of power. So that's pretty good. That's going to power well more than any base game ship, except for the laser station, I guess. And you can stick a few of these together and really go crazy. Although your radiator space needs are going to become immense. And then you can also just try and really make the temperature as high as possible to save on radiator space. And kind of to show off. So here's one I made. It only produces, under half a megawatt, but its outlet temp is 3,000 kelvins. I had to use tungsten rhenium as the two materials here because that's all that I could find that was safe use at that temperatures. Had to use diamond as the neutron reflector, tantalum carbide and hafnium carbide for the components of the reactor. Really, I just had to take everything to the max in terms of temperature tolerance here to make this work. So there is in the files a nuclear reactor model that you can use that uses turbines the way one on Earth does, but I don't know anything about how those work, and I don't think it works very well in the game, honestly. It's kind of unfinished content. So I did make a couple of example ships with this. So here's an example of kind of a cheap gunship, runs on oxygen and RP1. Power consumption is low, so it can run on just two of those super high temp example reactors, which have their high temp radiators here. You can see them glowing white. These are the radiators for the crew module. You can see they're actually larger than the ones for the high temp reactor because they have to operate at such a lower temperature. And then this just has 3 of those 90 millimeter guns and 3 of those 30 millimeter guns on the front of it to sort of blast forwards. And fairly decent armor, mostly fairly cheap materials. I mean, I do use a little bit of reinforced carbon, which is not cheap, but only 5 millimeters of it. And so you can see the whole ship costs under 10 million credits. So you can make a whole bunch of these and only weighs 1.38 kilotons. So given a set mass and cost budget, you could use a lot of these. It also has flares on the sides to try and deal with any incoming missiles because it's pretty defenseless against those otherwise. So then I made an example, large scale craft here. Very large scale here. Weighs almost 15,000 tons. Costs 235 million credits. This is basically the scale of the gunship from the base game. And you can see this guy has got 3 of those heavy coil guns, 3 of those heavy rail guns, and 1 of those 160 megawatt lasers with 12 mounts scattered around. And so the idea is that this should be a combatant that can go up against pretty much anything and fight it on pretty good terms. Can use the laser to shoot down incoming missiles, and can blast away with the railguns and coil guns on the front at high range and destroy its enemies. And it's got this cool hexagonal pattern. Got more expensive armor. Big chunk of graphite aerogel in there. And then, last but not least, I made an example carrier. And this here, it carries, let's see, each of these has 30 drones, so it carries 90 of those little gun drones and 180 little micro flak missiles. Then it's got 3 little rail guns and 2 little lasers on it to defend itself. And it's kind of in the medium category for size and cost. 3 kilotons, 49.6 million credits. Yeah, just kind of a mid-range vessel here that can put out a large quantity of drones and missiles to do strikes on enemy targets in the same sphere of influence. So that's basically it for Module Design Mark II. I mean, really, a lot of it is just experimentation, figuring out what works, what doesn't. For payload, you can see I had to take the flare from the Ordnance and then turn it into a payload here so that I can launch out of a blast launcher. But yeah, basically, that's my concepts for module design right now. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you have any thoughts. And thank you very much for watching.